Hi, my name is Corey Delahousie, and I want to welcome you to Sound Off, Louisiana. This morning, Robert Burns and I had a conversation with regards to my recent civil suit against the Louisiana State Inspector General's office. I'm asking you to reach out to your senators and state representatives and ask them to abolish, not to cut the funding, but to abolish the State Inspector General's office for several reasons, a lot of which you'll find out during this interview. But just as a glimpse into their world, I want you to know, as a private citizen, these people went and obtained my medical records and read my medical records into the public record. They raided my home at 6 o'clock in the morning with my children there. And all for naught. So I'm asking you to watch the video that you're with me and Mr. Robert Burns, and you form your own opinion. Contact your legislators. Let them know that you're tired of your tax-paying dollars being wasted on the Inspector General's office, and ask that office be completely abolished and the resources go to higher education or other resources within the state of Louisiana that can benefit better. Because Mr. Stephen Street and his office are doing nothing more than bullying people. Thank you for your time today. We greatly appreciate it, and we hope you enjoy this interview.
Hello neighbor, it's Robert Burns returning to you once again to bring in a guest who we had only 8 months ago, Corey Delahousie. And we're bringing Corey back for a follow-up interview because on Monday, February the 22nd of this year, 2016, Mr. Delahousie filed a civil lawsuit against the Office of Inspector General. And the core elements of that lawsuit involved malicious prosecution as well as defamation of character. So, Corey, would you care to elaborate as to who you feel engaged in that malicious prosecution and also why they did so?
Well, first of all, thanks for taking the time out of your day to meet with me. The reason the suit was filed is for a variety of reasons. Most importantly, the State Inspector General is an agency that is only to investigate Louisiana state covered agencies and its contractors. At no point in time was I ever contracted with the state of Louisiana, and nor was I a subcontractor to the state of Louisiana. But during the course of the last 3.5 years, the Inspector General's office has been investigating me and going so far into my personal life and my personal records, which were outside the scope of my contract with Livingston Parish. And the reason it's important to know all these little details is because as a private citizen, the Office of Inspector General illegally obtained my medical records. They illegally raided my house with a SWAT team. They illegally seized over 40 computers that I had housed. They shut down my business by getting my server, my printers, every computer in my office. So what they did was so far egregious and outreaching and beyond the scope of their own jurisdiction that I had no other choice but to file suit for the malicious prosecution. I'm not like Murphy Painter, I'm not a Bruce Greenstein, I'm not any state employee who has the right to be investigated by the IG's office. I'm a private citizen. And so I think they need to be held accountable for their actions. And the way I look at it for any viewer or any layman is simple. If I walked into your house and I stole your computers and I walked out, as a person I would be held accountable. Right. And it would be a crime. Right. And so I don't see why they should be any different. Okay. You came into my house at 6 o'clock in the morning with a SWAT team. Not like I'm a drug lord or I'm not making meth, and I'm not from Livingston Parish making meth. But you walk into my house at 6 in the morning with guns drawn, with my kids in bed, and don't use any evidence seized out in my house. Not one document, not one paper. So, it was very malicious, and the attacks that came after that and the publicity is something that I think it's time that the IG be held accountable for everything they did to me.
I understand. Well, for the benefit of some viewers who may be tuning in for the first time, basically, you served as an FBI informant entailing cleanup operations for Hurricane Gustav, correct?
I did, and during that investigation, working with the FBI and the Joint Task Force, which consisted of the EPA and Office of Inspector General on the federal level, the information that I uncovered was also provided to the State Inspector General's office. And I was told at that time, when I presented the information, that it wasn't something that they were considered to be of interest.
Wait, I want to make sure I get this straight. The dollar amount, if I recall correctly, and I think we'll give or take $1 million or two, but it was around $58 million.
Right. At the time that I presented information to the Office of Inspector General's office, the bill had escalated to almost $92 million. The bill at that point, and the evidence that I had in my possession, was at $72 million.
Okay.
And in 2014, IED, PEC, AFA, the contractors, and Livingston Parish went through an arbitration case in Washington, D.C., and they were asking for $59 million.
Okay.
So, and all of that information was used in the arbitration that I had gathered to defend FEMA's position and deny their money.
All right. Well, and let me just ask you this. Do you feel, without your efforts, that in all likelihood those invoices probably would have been paid at the $58 million?
I think had I not intervened in the way that I did intervene, that they may have gotten paid a substantial portion of those funds. But it needs to be known that at some point in time, whether it be me or someone later down the road, in an audit, they would have found that they were improperly paid. I went beyond just a normal audit and found that there are times where an invoices had been created in such a manner that they falsified.
Okay.
They falsified truckloads. They falsified tickets. They illegally cut trees on private property. So it was just the things that I uncovered were way outside the scope of what the normal auditor would review, because I was actually on the ground reviewing these documents.
Okay. Well, I assume then from that vantage point, if approximately $58 million did not get paid, and quite likely, maybe not 100%, but quite likely as a result of your efforts, do you feel like that put a pretty big target on your back from that day forward?
I mean, there was no doubt that it was a target. I was threatened multiple times prior to even, I began to expose the fraud in small increments, and notified the parish that we had issues that needed to be addressed, so that some of the funds should not have been paid. Livingston Parish was the only parish at the time who had paid in excess of over $300,000 to private citizens to lease their property for burn sites and disposal sites. And although it might not sound that it's that expensive, Livingston Parish was the only parish to have leases on private citizens' properties in excess of 18 months, whereas everybody else had done it within 6. So there were just so many things that were wrong that I had no choice but to explain and defend the position of why we should or should not pay some of these instances.
All right. Well, let me just say this. You mentioned Murphy Painter a second ago. I went to his criminal trial. Can't say if you can call it that. It was one, but one of the two attorneys in that was Al Robert Jr., and he is now representing Mr. Painter in a civil matter against the OIG, just as he's representing you. And I will not ever forget, and I know I mentioned this in the first interview we did, during a period in the federal trial, the jury was not present for this, but I believe Mr. Robert probably made one of the most profound quotes of the entire trial. Like I said, the jury was not present, but he said, and I'm going to quote him verbatim, he looked directly at Federal Judge Brady and he said, and I quote, "Your Honor, this is not the FBI. This is the OIG. These people do not know what they're doing," unquote. And from reading over your lawsuit, it would appear that he is more than adequately backing up that contention that the OIG engaged in activities that they were not permitted to do,
right.
Gathered evidence that they were not permitted to gather. But going to the core of them pursuing you, what is it that they alleged that you did?
Well, and they alleged multiple things, but at the core of the investigation with the OIG, and if you read it, it's in the lawsuit, it's clearly laid out, but they were asked to investigate me back in 2012, in June of 2012. And it was with regards to $6,000 worth of billing out of $2.5 million. So we're talking 0.006% of my overall billing.
Mm-hmm.
And they're asked to review that billing and issue a report. A year later, on July 17th of 2015, and during that entire year that they had been investigating me, I had cooperated fully. all the while maintaining that you don't have jurisdiction to even be investigating me. But on July 17th of 2013, they got a warrant to search my home and notified us that they now considered my case to be a criminal case. What's ironic, because a month before they were notified by the federal government that the federal government declined to even investigate me because I was, one, an informant, and two, had provided 50-something million in fraud to them to support defending FEMA. That being said, a week and a half, 8 days later, they raided my house with the warrant and seized all this evidence. Now, I've had many theorists ask me, well, do you think it's because you had so much information that they wanted to know what you had in regard to the FEMA arbitration? Or was it they were just bullying you? What circumstances led to it? And quite honestly, I don't know. And at this juncture, I don't care.
Right.
The fact that they illegally did what they did and dragging my family through what they've drug us through, you can't put a dollar figure on it. But it's unfathomable when I explain it to people and try to tell them that this is what we've lived through. I think the other thing that's most important about what they've done that is so egregious is to mention in my medical records into a public record and assume that I'm having procedures when I'm literally picking up a drug, or to state that I was under anesthesia at the time of one of my doctor visits when I was administered a pill, to state that I had over 30 Botox injections. This isn't a face of Botox, buddy. I mean, it needs a lot of work. So if I had 30 injections of Botox, then we have a serious problem. To state that I was in a tanning bed, to go to the gym and get my gym club records and say that I'm in a tanning bed. Robert, the most fascinating part about that portion of this trial was that they're claiming I was in a tanning bed during the months of May, June, July, and August. I visited a tanning bed 6 times. And anybody and everyone who knows me, and you're sitting here with me, I'm fairly dark. And in those summer months, I'm extremely dark. And it's not because I lay in a tanning bed, but the incompetence of Jessica Webb, the investigator who investigated me, stated on the stand that I was in a tanning bed for 30 minutes. Now, I don't know of anyone who tans for 30 minutes. I can cook a chicken in that time. But it's just a lack of experience. The fact that she illegally obtained my medical records in October, in late October, and 27 days later she's testified in front of a grand jury that I had all these medical procedures, but not once interviewed a nurse, a doctor, or anyone within that office to verify those procedures had actually been done.
Well, and that goes to the very core issue that we're talking about. And during the Painter trial, they had Shane Evans on the stand. He was asked by Mike Fowler just what extent he went to substantiate that he had selectively enforced alcohol statute. And he readily admitted he didn't do anything. And it sounds very similar here. What is your impression at this point of the Inspector General's office? I mean, their official purpose is to try and uncover fraud and therefore actually recover more than their own salaries are costing. And what is the picture that's beginning to emerge, at least this is my take on it, you can comment as to whether you feel that this is the picture that's emerging, but in the Painter case, very clearly, the efforts to go after him was as a result of his steadfast resolve that he was not going to approve a $300,000 exclusivity payment that was being made by Budweiser in order to gain rights to sell alcohol at Saints games, which was a violation of law, didn't sit well with the General Administration, and so then all of a sudden Murphy Painter was looked into to this degree. I wouldn't even want to fathom the cost that the Inspector General's office incurred. In fact, I'm going to make a public records request to get the legal billings only for lawsuits in which they have been named as defendant. I don't care, they can redact out the subject matter that was discussed. I just want the numbers. The legal bills that racked up there, for the criminal prosecution, the legal fees that have now been incurred for his lawsuit. Who knows how much legal fees will be incurred for yours, but it sure sounds like yours is even more so that you said that, if I heard you correctly, that's not a priority what you presented to them, the $58 million, but yet your item which was a small fraction of your billings, shot up to the top of the priority
Well,
list.
and I think when you're looking at the overall picture, so you just made something abundantly clear. When you look at how much money the State Inspector General's office has actually brought in on their own, when you look at just the State Inspector General's office, they haven't done jack.
Okay.
And the majority of the cases that they've worked on, when you look at what they've done it in joint task forces with the FBI or federal OIG. But what they've done independently to bring in resources on their own has been zero. Look at their account. Look at the number of indictments and or charges brought against any individual by the OIG only. The number is staggering. Out of over 200 cases, they have less than 0.5% success rate. So I think at this juncture, with state legislators wanting to find ways to cut the budget, start at the top. Stephen Street is redacted. He is the kind of guy that needs to be taken out of office. His budget needs to be completely abolished. When you have incompetent investigators like Jessica Webb, who feel the need to raid a house with my children in it, for what reason we still don't know, then you need to look and analyze the people who are working with you. You need to realize that they are a duplication of the legislative auditor. They are a duplication of the state police. They're duplicating efforts on the federal level. So one has to ask, at this point in time in 2016, what purpose does his office serve other than to torment and belittle and bring down people like me, Murphy Painter, Bruce Greenstein, those of us who have done our jobs? With me, separating me from them, I'm a private citizen you didn't even have the jurisdiction to investigate me, much less do all the things that you did. And to answer another question about where we are with the State Inspector General's office, Stephen Street has gone way beyond the call in interviews and stated in interviews that, well, if the judge overturned my case or other cases that would be up for review. That makes me question, if you know that you're doing wrong, don't you think you ought to change your policies and procedures to reflect such? You don't allow rogue investigators to do what they've done. Now, Greg Ferries, who is probably the most spineless individual I've ever met in my life, had the audacity to walk up in my driveway the day they raided my house and said, like we were in 1875 in the Wild Wild West, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Okay, Dirty Harry, the situation is you don't have the right to be on my property. So I shouldn't be threatened when you don't even have the right to be here. And the fact that they believe they're omnipotent and that no one is ever going to touch them needs to come to an end, and it needs to come to an end now. These people have no reason to hold any position within law enforcement because, one, they're incompetent. Two, they don't respect the laws that were designed specifically for them. And last but not least, these people, under the advice of their own lawyers, keep failing and are failing in their success rate of bringing criminals to justice, are bringing the criminals to a full trial. Their success rate is below par. And so if you look at their budget and what they're supposed to bring in, since Stephen Street has been in office, his budget is here and his return ratio is far below.
Well, and that budget, as you held your hand up, that wasn't factoring in litigation expenses that he would, and that alone, litigation expenses of defending the actions that this body has engaged in has got to be staggering. Like I said, I'm going to get a figure, but it's going to be far more than they brought in. And I don't know if you saw this earlier on the...
Not to interrupt you, but with that being said, is it fair for the taxpayers to pay for someone's incompetence?
I think that's an excellent question to be posed, and I think the obvious answer ought to be no.
No, because you have an official who is sitting there not knowing what the left hand is doing or the right hand is doing. You have a rogue investigator like Jessica Webb who has done all these malicious things to me, getting my records, raiding my house. You have Greg Ferries who believes he's above the law, omnipotent, untouchable, nobody will ever do anything to him, well, because his reputation stands on its own. And then you have the most incompetent IG I've ever read about or heard about. And yet they're still collecting a salary. Now, Jessica has moved on. She's left the IG's office.
Jessica was at the investigator level, correct? Was there not anyone there? My beef with the Inspector General's office, I mean, Ms. Webb may very well argue, well, I was doing my job that I was told to do.
But who told her?
Well, that's my point. That's my point. Is there such inadequate supervision that, as Mr. Robert would indicate, that it's a loose cannon operation, and I quote, "These people do not know what they're doing," and that was his verbatim quote. And what I'd like to, Drew, as we come to a conclusion on this, I'd like for you to spend just a few moments, if you would mind doing so. I know you've kind of hit the high points, but just what all of an impact did this whole episode have on your family? I mean, I'm gonna just let you use your own words here.
Well,
but
you know, I think when you live in a certain world, when you live in the world that we live in, my family, as a whistleblower, I knew that there would be consequences to being a whistleblower. I never in a million years that those consequences that I would face would come from law enforcement. You know, I stood and upheld the laws and supported and brought forth the allegations of fraud, over 50 million that are taxpayers' money. I never in a million years thought that a state agency would beat me down and intimidate my family the way they did for standing up for what was right. Mm-hmm. And not once ever asking, what can we do to further help or assist in the investigation on the federal level to support the taxpaying citizens of Louisiana? And with that has come a heavy burden. I mean, my children have had to live in fear of every time they see a sheriff's deputy, wondering if they're going to raid our house. Mm-hmm. I have had to constantly be on guard and on the defensive when we're out in public because it's become so public. People recognize me from the newspaper or news media, and they discuss and want to discuss my case in front of my children. You know, it's taken a tremendous toll on my wife, the stress of having to go through all these court proceedings and having all my name all over the press. But the worst part of it all, and in a nutshell, and I know I keep going back to July 25th, 2013, when they raided my home, but that's the worst part of this investigation. You could have come after me as the individual all you wanted. Mm-hmm. You could have interviewed me and interrogated me until the cows come home. Mm-hmm. But to pull my children out of bed with a SWAT team.
And what were their ages at that time?
My son was 7, my daughter was 11. To raid my home at 6 in the morning, the impact it's had on my children.
Yes.
My son doesn't go to bed without a light on any longer. Mm-hmm. My daughter, as you know, I'm not going to discuss her private,
sure,
the private thing, but she's had struggles. Mm-hmm. My wife has, you know, and I both in dealing with the marital woes that go with any normal trial, along with just any everyday activities. But the depression, the anxiety, you know, this is, Robert, we're at a stage where I feel like I'm in post-traumatic stress disorder because I've been in such a battle for so long to prove I'm innocent. Mm-hmm. And now that this part is over, I'm angry. Sure. Over the sensation that what you did to me was not only wrong, but it was illegal. Mm-hmm. And if the shoe were on the opposite foot, and I'd have done to you what you did to me, I'd go to jail. Mm-hmm. And although realistically, Stephen Street will never see jail time, right, I'm begging and pleading that our Attorney General takes an initiative and looks at this case and uses it as an example of what not to do. Mm-hmm. I think Jessica Webb should be held accountable for every one of her actions.
As well as those who oversaw her.
And Greg Ferries. I think Greg Ferries needs to be held accountable for his actions because at no point in time did they have the right to do what they did. And the worst part is they knew it. And said,
or certainly should have known it.
No, they knew it.
Okay.
Because they told us, and they've told Joe Kraft, who was my lawyer at one point, and they told John McClendon in my criminal trial, we've never had anyone challenge us on this before.
Well, yeah, Mr. McClendon made that abundantly clear. Hey, the reason they've been able to do this all these times is nobody's challenged it. And Judge Rakes was pretty emphatic in her ruling that you exceeded your authority mm-hmm. in every instance that Mr. McClendon cited. And if you go to the link for our previous interview, I won't go into all the detail, but we have Mr. McClendon's filings that he made in order to get those type rulings from Judge Ricks. And then it didn't stop there. They said, well, just because they wear, Scott Perrielou made the infamous quote, just because they wear a black robe doesn't mean they know everything. And, you predicted back in June, I have the video, you said, let's say you do. And you said, of course I won't be convicted, you know, and here we are 8 months later, your predictions have all come true,
right.
and now the shoe's on the other foot, and I guess there may be at least some satisfaction in being the aggressor now.
On the lighter, well, yeah, being on the offense is always better than being on the defense. But on a lighter note, you know, I've had friends in the media who've said I should go into a 1-800 psychic line because I kind of predicted how everything would unfold, and it's really practical. It's not. I think if this would have been a true test of the State Inspector General's abilities to delve into crime and to do what they're supposed to do under Louisiana constitutional laws, I firmly believe they would have identified the fraud I identified in the FEMA arbitration. Mm-hmm. And they would have investigated it thoroughly so that the companies who perpetrated those crimes would be sitting in my shoes. Mm-hmm. And I would be working with OIG to defend the state of Louisiana against monies that were paid and are billed for that were never paid, which are falsifying public records. Mm-hmm. Ironically, which are the same crimes they charged me with. So, if there was any respect and integrity within the State Inspector General's office, and if Stephen Street had any decency, for one, he would issue a formal apology to my family for everything that his office has done. Mm-hmm. And he would resign. Mm-hmm. And if the state legislators of the state of Louisiana had any idea or would like to cut funding in any fraction of the state, they would focus in on the State Inspector General's office, who literally does nothing to serve the public. They are a duplication of efforts of the state police and legislative auditors, and frankly, I haven't seen anything that they've done that has been productive. They haven't. In my case alone, they were supposed to issue a report on their findings. Never done. The investigator testifies that she didn't even know she had to do it. So if you're that incompetent, mm-hmm. And the only way you're surviving is off the taxpayer money, mm-hmm. off the budget of the state of Louisiana, I firmly believe state legislators and representatives need to look at them mm-hmm. and make a unanimous decision to, one, cut their budget and abolish their office, and two, hold them accountable for their actions for their complete disregard to the law.
Well, and obviously your attorney, Mr. Robert, would, I'm sure, have sentiments along those lines, because he sure didn't wince for words in saying that these people, quote, do not know what they're doing, unquote. Well, Corey, it's been a delight to come and visit with you again at Sound Off, Louisiana, where the trial was assigned to Judge Mike Caldwell. You have our assurance that we are certainly going to be there for every hearing that would take place for this trial and keep you up to date on how it's progressing. I want to commend you personally for standing up for the taxpayers. I know I did that toward the end of the previous video, like I said, I'm sure it's a little bit better to be on the aggressor side mm-hmm. than it was to be on defense. But nothing can erase what you relayed in terms of your children that particular morning. I never endured anything traumatic like that with my father at such a young and tender age. I believe you said your son was 7. Mm-hmm. But on behalf of just one individual taxpayer, I want to apologize for what you were put through, even though I had nothing to do with it. But, that's the reason this whole blog was formed, was to try to give folk like this an opportunity to sound off. That's why it was named. And I think, Corey, you've done a great job of doing this. I want to extend my appreciation for you agreeing to visit with me. And
thank you.
And look forward to this trial progressing, and we'll see both how it turns out as well as how the Inspector General's office as a whole turns out. Thank you so much for tuning in. We look forward to bringing you an update on this civil lawsuit filed by Corey Delahousse. Thank you once again.